We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
When you can't trust the institutions charged with your financial and physical well-being, where do you turn? As the Federal Reserve exposes its own inherent flaws and the rest of the world decides to ditch the dollar, it's time to ask why and who is to blame. Well, when the government itself blames citizens for its own reckless behavior, the words of Dwight Eisenhower spring to mind when he said, "The search for a scapegoat is the easiest of all hunting expeditions." Welcome back to Liberty Nation Radio here on the Radio America Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. On today's show, we talk the reckless Federal Reserve, de-dollarization, the real threat of China, and talk liberty on constitutional issues. I want to take a moment to say a special thank you to our listeners out in Evergreen, Alabama on WNWF 1470 AM and WPNS on 1140 AM. Thank you for being here. And remember, this show is proudly sponsored by LibertyNation.com, where you can access podcasts, breaking news, analysis, and a range of biting and brilliant shows to whet your appetite for freedom and your fondness for the great American Constitution. The Federal Reserve goes before the Senate Banking Committee to answer questions on the Silicon Valley Bank collapse, among other issues. Now, this is a fast-developing story, and to join us to speak about what happened in the hearings and associated paraphernalia to do with the banking crisis, we're joined by economics editor, Mr. Andrew Moran. Thanks for joining us, Andrew.
Thank you for having me, and I'll be sure to use my ChatGPT for all the answers that you may have. Questions you may have.
Sure. I mean, as long as we want it written by a fairly mediocre left-leaning college student, that those are the kind of answers we're after from our chat GTP. But now, Andrew, obviously you watched the Senate hearings, and the Republican Party, they were really blaming the Fed for doing what the Fed does, weren't they?
Yeah, so it was interesting because Michael Barr, he's the Fed vice chair for supervision, and in his opening testimony, he was saying that the Federal Reserve saw weak spots at SVB as early as May 2022, and then a few months later, they actually gave it a lowered its management rating to, I think it was fair. So they saw, and it's funny too because you and I talked about this a couple of shows ago, how there should have been weaknesses spotted way before what happened in February and March. So that revelation for the Federal Reserve was pretty eye-opening to how pervasive the issues were at SVB.
Now, does this mean that the warning signals were ignored? Because if you're operating in the banking sector, you want things to be superb rating, or at least extremely safe rating, whereas a fair management structure warning, I mean, that's a warning, isn't it? That's not, hey, it's fair, it's okay. That's actually a warning sign. So warning signs ignored.
Exactly. And also, it can show how outdated the stress tests are, at least in this specific case. So a stress test is supposed to determine how well a bank can fare in a specific type of environment, whether it's rising interest rates or lower GDP growth rate. So during the Senate banking hearing, that was some of the cases that these Republicans made, is that, okay, well, if the SVB passed its stress tests, then how did all of this happen? And the Democrats on the other side were saying, well, see, it's less regulation. It's a deregulation campaign that fostered this environment of bank failures. Meanwhile, it had nothing to do with regulation for the collapse of SVB. It had more to do with, the Federal Reserve's easy money policies, terrible management at the SVB. What was interesting about SVB is that they didn't have a risk compliance officer or risk management officer, but they had a diversity, equity, and inclusion officer. So it just shows how terribly managed this company was.
It seems to me that the prioritizing of diversity in the human resource department over safety and investment management, it's a pervasive illness.
ESG is at the very moment dying. You look at some of the numbers showing and the data showing it's been on a steady decline since its peak in 2020 or 2021. And it's understandable too, because a lot of Republican-led states, they're targeting, it was led by, of course, Ron DeSantis in Florida, but they're really targeting ESG and sustainable investing, and how this woke investing isn't benefiting investors or retirees. It's just more benefiting leftists and who want to impose their wokeology on Wall Street.
Well, I think that's really the heart of the issue, isn't it? You've got responsible fiduciary officers, and their job. They have, it's that old meme, isn't it? You had one job to do, and that's to securely grow the investment pot. And if they're taking into account other factors, any such factors will be a detriment.
Well, there are many problems with ESG in itself. I think also a thing that many people avoid talking about is how ESG and the fund managers and the companies that adopt ESG completely ignore the social and governance factors. All about being environmentally friendly. There was, I mentioned this with Jeff Charles, and I was talking about, there was a CIBC report a year or two ago, and it talked about how a lot of energy companies that abided by the whole ESG nonsense, they were investing in Vladimir Putin's energy companies. They were investing in Russia and completely ignoring the authoritarian nature of Moscow. So I think that's what's one interesting factor. The other interesting factor is the idea of greenwashing. Now, greenwashing is pervasive. You look at a lot of the industry surveys, that is a common theme people are so worried about. This means that companies will claim to be green even though they have no green policies whatsoever. So a lot of authorities, investing authorities and governments, they're trying to impose standards that you abide by to at least have a modicum of ESG principles in your company.
If you go down the local supermarket and you see a pack of eggs, if you're fortunate to see a pack of eggs in the supermarket nowadays, and it says it's organic, free-range eggs or organic free-range meat, and it's all just labeling, it's all just advertising, and doesn't actually have a specific definition with which to determine this is this and that is that.
Organic farming, although my family, we spend so much money on organic products, mainly because of my wife, but organic destroyed the economy of Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka adopted the whole ESG principles. They had a 100% score on ESG ratings. What happened? Company completely collapsed. They have a food crisis. They have a humanitarian crisis, so much poverty. All these farmers that did really well and were pretty much, I would say, one of the breadbaskets of South Asia, they became poor overnight because of the government's insistence of adhering to Klaus Schwab and the World Economic Forum and this whole sustainable investment fiasco that just crashed the entire economy. And who knows if they'll ever be able to recover from that.
You know, the funny thing about that, I followed that story quite closely, and it seems to me that the only time we've seen such a thing happen is when a country adopts socialism. And to me, it seems as though ESG and socialism, it seems they're different sides of the same coin. Or am I far out on that?
Well, with ESG, I mean, it's especially with that whole Biden executive order, it's if the government's imposing this on the people, whether it's retirement plans, executive orders, whatever the case. And then you have sort of backdoor too, whereby these leftist groups will go on social media and complain and whine and say, "Oh, look, we're going to boycott this company because it's not imposing one of these ESG principles." So you either have a government force or you have backdoor stealth style imposition by the state.
Yeah, these grassroots, I'm using the air quotes here when I say these grassroots activists, or party apparatchiks, as they used to be called. One more thing for you, Andrew, here. I've got a little excerpt I'd like to listen to and get your quick take on this. This is from Sherrod Brown during the Senate banking hearing.
Just as there are no atheists in foxholes, it appears that when there is a bank crash, there are no libertarians in the Silicon Valley.
What do you make of that, Andrew?
I cannot agree more with Sherrod Brown. I mean, I don't agree with a lot of government policy. Let's say student loans, for example. You know, the government will go after student loans. They'll go to the courts. They'll say the government shouldn't be in the business of student loans. But at the same time, a lot of conservatives let's say in Silicon Valley, they'll say right away, "Oh, the government needs to intervene. The government needs to prevent this whole banking crisis from happening. And the government just needs to spend all this money, print all this money, give all these well-connected executives and elites, taxpayer dollars." Yeah, it's important to stress how there isn't intellectual consistency whatsoever. You're only intellectually consistent when it's not impacting you as it seems, as it did with Silicon Valley.
Absolutely. No freedoms ever came with the words, "You know what the government needs to do?" Andrew Moran, thanks ever so much. We'll be right back with Andrew talking the de-dollarization campaign. Don't go anywhere. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides. Entertaining, informative, and just plain fun. Watch Liberty Nation's The Conservative Five. Produced by conservatives for conservatives. C5's The Left Free Zone. Hosted by Liberty Nation's Lisa K. Donner. Joined by a raucous, irreverent panel of authors. Deconstructing leftist narratives. Debating the hot topics. And remembering to laugh. Join the official conservative safe space.
You only did that to piss Jeff off.
Liberty Nation's The Conservative 5.